So this our session, our time together today, for those people who have leaned on this community for many years or weeks or months, and to those people who are here for the very first time today, I want to throw out the reality of not knowing, the existential state that we find ourselves in day in and day out, of how much we don't know. As Mark said to me earlier, that can be a blessing, and for some of us, it can be an incredible source of pain, an area of spiritual practice for us to look at closely and immerse ourselves in today. So I want to start by sharing a Hasidic story. You're going to get the text of the story in the chat in a few minutes. So I just want to invite you into the space to receive this story that I'm going to share, and know that you will get a copy of it a little bit later if you want to say, where was that story from? So the story begins with Reb Avigdor Halberstam, the brother of Reb Chaim of Zantz. So Rabbi Halberstam was once the honored guest for Shabbat in the town, and the house where he was invited to was one of the most prominent citizens of this town. Now, the custom in these parts was that the host, who was hosting this wonderful Shabbat meal, would take the pot of cholent, this classic Shabbat stew that begins cooking before Shabbat and then stays warm all through Shabbat, all the way through to Shabbat lunch, and is considered a filling, wonderful delicacy that everyone looks forward to all week. So the custom in this town was that the host would take this large pot of cholent, and he would lift this pot up and give it to his distinguished guest, who would be asked by way of compliment, as if this guest were the host, to apportion out the steaming, yummy stew into the plates or bowls of all the people sitting around the Shabbos table, family, friends. So as the cholent pot was passed to him, Reb Avigdor caught a whiff of it. He smelled it and he tasted it, and he tasted it again and again, until bit by bit, he finished the entire pot of cholent, leaving nothing for anyone else at the table. And then he sat back and he asked, is there perhaps a little more cholent? And at this too, they brought it to him and he finished it down to the last spoonful. So meanwhile, the host and his family are sitting there not knowing what to do with this. They knew that Rabbi Avigdor was a tzaddik, he was a righteous person, and that they had a unique spiritual mission in eating, in the act of taking food in, that this was a way of revealing sparks of sanctity hidden in the world. So they're trying to understand this. There's this wise person, and the way he was eating this cholent just really left them dumbfounded. But some of the students of Rebbe Avigdor were there, and in all their time, they had never, ever seen him do this at a Shabbos table before. So they gathered up their courage, and after some time had passed, after the Shabbos meal had come and gone, they asked him to share with them what were the hidden things that he had relished in that cholent when he ate the whole pot and then asked for more. So he turned to his students and he said, I'm sure that I can trust you with what I'm about to tell you. By mistake, the maid in that household flavored the cholent with kerosene instead of vinegar. Now, when that pot came to me, I could smell it and I could taste it. And I gathered that if our host and hostess would find out, the defenseless girl would never hear the end of it in the kitchen. She could lose her job. and I know that she is a penniless orphan. So I ate up the cholent and let them think of me whatever they please. Why should this orphaned servant have to suffer any abuse when I can prevent it? So some of you may have heard this story before. It's drawn from many different places, a treasury of Hasidic tales, which I'll give you the citation in a moment in our source sheet. But this story I come back to again and again as an indication to myself of the way I walk through the world, that we simply don't have all the information that we crave or that we would think or that we would like to assume in front of us when we find ourselves in a situation. And Rabbi Victor sharing the backstory on this with his students is, for me, I remember the first time I heard the story, it was kind of a jaw-dropping moment. So I want to think about the secret of cholent here. The cholent here in the story is a vehicle for the unknown, for things that are perhaps unpleasant and don't taste good, that are hidden, that could be damaging to people or could be destructive, and what we do with that information when it comes to us. And I was drawn to this excerpt of a poem, and here, Jordan, thank you for sharing the source sheet today. We'll scroll down to the second text, the stories at the top. This is a poem by the German poet Heinrich Heine, 19th century poet, from his poem called Princess Shabbat. And in this poem, he has this brief mention of cholent. And I was thinking about this excerpt in contrast to the story that I just shared. So I'll go ahead and read this out loud for those people who don't have access to the sheet at this time. So the poem is quite long. This is kind of in the heart of the poem. And he says, "For this cholent is the very food of heaven, which on Sinai God instructed Moses in the secret of preparing." So this kind of classic poem is kind of what I call the pshat of cholent, right? Like the simple meaning of cholent. Like cholent is very tasty. It's been a part of Jewish tradition for a very, very long time. People will kind of go back and forth about what's in your cholent, what makes it taste so good, what's the secret to this? And here we have this beautiful picture that cholent is mi Sinai, as we say, that cholent goes all the way back to God's meeting with Moses on Mount Sinai. Like cholent is so old, it is so sacred, it is so hidden, secret. Its magic goes all the way back to that kind of seminal moment in the life of the Jewish people. So I thought that's just beautiful. How nice to think that God made up, or Moses made up, the recipe for the original cholent. But then I thought to myself, the cholent that appears in our story is it's very different, right? It's a very, it's not yummy. It's not desirable. It has, again, a sense of danger around it, right? Depending on what that cholent could become a vehicle for someone losing their job or getting kicked out of the kitchen, or, all those different things, for shame, right? For feeling a sense of failure. And so I thought to myself, what if cholent really isn't just this magical stew that tastes so good, right? But cholent is the very thing that is in our hands that can be used in different ways, that can be a pivot point for showing rachamim, for showing compassion to other people, and not just looking to the cholent to be something that fulfills our own desires, that tastes good, that is predictable. It turns out that this story I shared is also quoted in Estelle Frankel's book, The Wisdom of Not Knowing. And I also included a quote from her book, so many beautiful nuggets of wisdom that she shares. But she says, "For most of us, The unknown is both friend and foe. At times, it can be a source of paralyzing fear and uncertainty. And at other times, it can be a starting point for adventure, creativity, and transformation. So thank you, Jordan. If you want to take the text sheet down, I appreciate you sharing it. Mark mentioned at the very beginning of our sit today, when we come together in this place and time, we have a taste of Shabbat available to us. We have a taste here today of sitting with the unknown. It's available to us every day, whether we're sitting or not. But this is our time to open up to the starting point that it can be for adventure, creativity, and transformation, and to see and maybe to name in ourselves if we're feeling paralyzing fear and uncertainty, and how we might pivot on that, as Estelle is inviting us to do, to a place of gratitude, of adventure, of creativity, of the what can be, how is the future unfolding, and how might we transform in this moment, Dafka specifically, because we don't know. So I invite you into that space for the next 12 minutes or so. And the breath is an anchor that's available to many of us. It is known and unknown, the breath. And if the breath is something that is not available to you today as a focal point, you might pick a part of your body somewhere where you can go into this place of looking at the unknown in your own life, in your own body, in the experience of where you are in this moment. As we prepare to close our sit and move towards Kaddish together as a community, the prayer for those who have lost a loved one, close with Estelle Frankel's words, once again, bringing us hope and chizuk and strength into the coming week. She says, for most of us, the unknown is both friend and foe. At times, it can be a source of paralyzing fear and uncertainty. And at other times, it can be a starting point for adventure, creativity, and transformation. May this entire community be strengthened this week and in the weeks to come through considering the unknown to be this starting point, and to see and notice that own paralysis or fear inside of us in the moment, to give ourselves another chance to turn back toward a positive, if yet unknown aspect of the unknown.
Thank you so much, Susan. And Susan mentioned, let's hold space right now for those in mourning, create a minyan of support and comfort. If you are in mourning, observing a yard site, if it's your custom to join in the Kaddish, you're invited to do so and put the name or names of those you're honoring today in the chat now or after you recite Kaddish. If you're not reciting Kaddish, as always, please, if you can, please stay present and lend your support to those who are, who I invite to join me by rising in body or in spirit, and you can unmute at this time. Yitkadal, Das Mirabah, Divlaki, Evianlicha, Buke, Kaye Kon, Yome Kon, Yedu, Beit Israel, Bahavala,
Amen.
Amen. Friends, thanks for joining us today. I want to, if you're leaving us now, just a reminder, we hope you'll join us tomorrow. We'll be led tomorrow by Zach Newman of Hamakom, be joining us from the United Kingdom. We have an international flavor the next couple of days. Zach will be leading us tomorrow, and on Friday, Kimberly Duenas of Jutina Eco will be joining us, I believe, from El Salvador to lead us, help us sit into Shabbat together. And just a note that next Monday, as I mentioned, is a 4-year anniversary of our daily sit. It will be led by Sarah Waxman of At the Well. It will be Rosh Chodesh Adar Bet, the second month of Adar in this leap year, and bringing us just less than 2 weeks from then into Purim, and very much look forward to that as well. So if you're leaving us now, be well. We hope to see you soon. If you're staying on, as you're welcome to do, please, you can use the time just to continue to sit with us, or you can join conversation with Susan about this teaching today about this practice of not knowing. Thanks to Jordan Pollock for holding our space for all of us, this Tech Mishkan Tabernacle, so competently and with skill and grace. And Susan, let's bring you in. You had me at chillant. Lunchtime. Now I'm really hungry. The Orthodox synagogue in my neighborhood is having apparently a chillant cook-off on Shabbat, which have made my ears perked up. But more seriously, thank you so much for, as always, for a beautiful teaching. And it struck me that this theme of not knowing, there are certain kind of, I think, phrases or concepts that really kind of represent a distillation of mindfulness, and this is one of them. Like, you want to say, well, how do you practice mindfulness? Well, you can practice mindfulness by just practicing not knowing in the moment. Like that's all you need to do. Let go of, keep an open mind, as it's called in other traditions, beginner's mind. We have our own terms for it, heat lamdut, curiosity, right? So I want to thank you for that, and also for including and ending with that Estelle Frankel quote, which really hit home for me, that not knowing can be a friend and a foe. It can be deeply uncomfortable, and it also can be exciting. It's like, it represents receptivity. This is exciting. What's next? What's going to happen next, right? And it's all shaped by our experience. Like, oh no, now what? Now what's going to happen? Or like, oh, this is great. Now what's next? And I can feel both of those things. I think we all probably can feel to some extent both of those things. So I want to, here's my question for you based on that, which has to do with the foe, not knowing as a foe. When we feel fear, anxiety, as I shared with you before we began, there's nothing major, well, nothing life-threatening, but my family's waiting on some information with bated breath, and it's anxiety producing. It's not pleasant. So it strikes me that it's, in terms of that this is part of our practice of working with the unpleasant, working with what's uncomfortable. And I'm wondering about the relationship between our capacity to do that, which opens up a path to it being more of a friend and more of a source of joy, if that makes sense. In other words, in short, what's the suggestion for dealing with the anxiety and fear that comes from not knowing something?
It's funny looking back through the lens of the story, Mark. I'm thinking of playfulness. It as kind of being a really very difficult for me personally, but I can see it through the story of what if I didn't talk a lot about the guests around this table of the story, right? And like the anxiety that they're feeling, and the assumptions that we assume they're making about him being rude, or how could he do that, or what is he thinking by eating the whole pot of cholent, right? But what if we were guests around that table? What if instead of leaving that table with a sense of judgment, we left with a sense of playfulness, curiosity, silliness? Like, this has never happened in life, and we don't know why he did what he did, but isn't that curious? Instead of trying to slot it into experiences that are already known to us.
Mm-hmm.
When we come to a Shabbos table, we sit down. It's nice. The cholent tastes good. Everybody behaves a certain way. And when we encounter something that doesn't fit into the boxes of our past experience, that's where the fear and paralysis sets in. But what if we could think, oh my gosh, this is just the most curious, silly thing that happened at the Shabbat table. And I have no idea why, but just to sit and live with that instead of trying to reconcile it into past experience or how things should be.
Mm-hmm.
The cholent is always shared. The cholent is always tasty. Everyone's always well behaved around the Shabbat table. Those are paralyzing assumptions.
Yes, they are. Speaking from experience.
Yeah.
Lori has a really good, as usual, a good question and a challenging question. As someone who, quote, ate the faulty cholent to save face for family, friends, bosses, and colleagues through the years, believing it to be an action of rachamim and dignity, I now ask, what if allowing others the dignity of experiencing their own path and dignity of not having someone cover for them? What about that as a true act of respect? I'm just wondering, because it's the story, it's a very emblematic Hasidic story, right? But I think the question, the kind of the ethical question about, like, is that the right thing to do there? Like, or is there another way to go? Or, what were the options there? Anyway, I want to lift up Lori's question.
Yeah, Lori, I thank you for asking this. There's so many beautiful reflections and questions in the chat. And I guess the first thing that popped into my mind, and it's a question, it's not an answer, is what is the power? Where does the power sit between the parties who are in any given situation, right, where there's this faulty cholent?
Mhm.
So I see a big power dynamic difference between this rabbi sitting at this table. And again, I'm making my own assumptions about that, right? And he made his own assumptions about the person in the kitchen.
Mhm.
But while noting those are assumptions, I wonder about the power differential, right, of that. And
Mhm.
who's eating the faulty cholent, who's taking the blow,
Mhm.
in this case, in one time, in Lori's case, repeated times, like who's taking that blow
Mhm.
over and over again, perhaps covering up things, perhaps
Mhm.
absorbing things that shouldn't be absorbed. So
Right.
one framing question I would use in each case would be to think, what is the power dynamic of these parties around this decision making, right?
Mhm.
Internal discernment around faulty cholent.
Right. That's really good. That's very good. I have to laugh a little bit just because that, the excerpt in relationship to cholent. What is the power dynamic in relationship to faulty cholent? Only here could we have such a conversation.
Yes, and brought by these incredibly unique sources, especially Heinrich Heine, who was,
Right.
this is about the most Jewish thing I
This is
think
great. It's
we
great.
have from him.
I
Yeah,
love that
so.
too. Yeah, I love that. The cholent from Sinai too. Like, okay.
Mhm.
Well, there's another good question from Laura. Um, this relates really to a question about assumptions we make or assumptions we form or opinions, I guess we form on about others and the relationship between that and not knowing. So her question is, do you have any thoughts about long-held negative assumptions about other persons in our lives and how to move in the direction of not knowing or being open towards them?
This already happened to me once this morning.
Right.
I was in a meeting with someone and I noticed the juxtaposition of one experience I had with some action that someone else took.
Mhm.
And I immediately made the assumption that those things were connected. And I shared the possibility of that with this other person. And she's like, oh no, that was just someone who has more information than I do, right? About the dynamics at play. And she said, oh no, that was just a coincidence, right? So
Mhm.
I think one of the questions I try to ask myself is, how do I know what I know? What am I relying upon in order to say I know something? And Mark, you can push me on this, but sometimes I think the most real thing we know is actually in our bodies.
Mhm.
And that is, I wouldn't say that's 100%, but let's just
Mhm.
go with it's probably 97%. And the other things, like my making the assumption that the way I viewed these people behaving in this meeting triggered another thing
Mhm.
to happen, that's not living inside of me. That's kind of the monkey mind, right? That of like, okay, I saw something, I have to make a connection
Right.
to that instead of going into my body and saying what's real in this moment.
Yeah. Thank you for, I mean, I'm not going to push back on that. I'm grateful that you brought that up. And, we at IJS and you probably too also often say, don't, just to quote our friend and colleague, Rabbi Sam Feinsmith, don't take my word for it. Check it out in your own experience, which includes check it out in your own body if this resonates for you, which, Harris is asking in the chat, that raises the question, can we ever fully know? And it's making me think, in terms of, your theme for today, how Jewish that is, of not knowing. I mean, we have all these examples even in the Torah of Moses not knowing and admitting, I don't know. I gotta ask God, right? Um, of the people not knowing where they're going, except by discerning where the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud is following them. They don't really, the itinerary is not laid out. There's some trust in moving into that stance of not knowing, not to mention that the way we learn is by asking questions, not by propounding the answers, right? And the paradigmatic Jewish learning experience is the Seder, which is a night of questions, of just asking questions, and questioning everything. That's so characteristic of our tradition, maybe to a fault sometimes, of just critiquing, asking questions. Why is that? Why is that? And even in Jewish law and halakha, we have halakha. We have, to some extent, in the halachic framework, you arrive at a position, but the oral tradition always keeps that fluid and moving, so that every answer is provisional for now, right? More will be revealed, more will be understood based on our experience and seeing something that we haven't seen before, individually or collectively. So maybe I don't know if you want to riff on that a little bit about how Jewish is this not knowing? If you want to riff.
Yeah, I know. I think it's so interesting, the reflection on kind of the oral Torah, right? The unfolding of that being the ultimate manifestation, I guess, of not knowing. One of the things I noticed in the chat, and I was going back on, and I realized about this story, is that some people are observing kind of this idea of, is it kindness what the rabbi did by shielding the maid in the kitchen from this, or was it sparing her an opportunity for growth or taking responsibility? And one of the things I realized is that I've also made the assumption that the story ends here. We don't actually know that. Like, we don't know. I don't know. Did Rabbi Victor have a subsequent conversation with the kitchen servant, right, at another Shabbat lunch, or privately, or, what is hidden in there about her path in understanding her mistake, or his gentle, again, these are questions, right? Was there some kind of follow-up conversation with Rabbi Victor and this servant? We don't know that, but I can feel that we might be uncomfortable with that being unresolved, right? Like, okay, he left with his hidden secret. She never knew what she did wrong. How's she going to grow? Is there protection going on? Are there assumptions? There might be, but we also might be assuming that the story ends there. So I got caught on that, Mark, as you were sharing your
good. That's really good.
Well,
we'll have to wait until it's, serialized on Netflix or something. I'm thinking this does remind me of some Downton Abbey episode where Mrs. Patmore does something, but I'll have to go look for that. I will. I will. One more excuse to go back to Downton Abbey.
There we go.
As always, thank you for today and for, all your contributions and for just being such a valued part of this community, and sharing your wisdom with us today. We're always grateful.
Thank you, Mark.
And thanks, of course, to Jordan for holding our space. Each of you for being here. Hope to see you tomorrow for practice with Zach Newman. Many blessings, everyone. Well.